Hampshire, June 1817. The Merriweather ballroom glittered with 1,000 candles reflected in polished mirrors, their golden light dancing across silk gowns and jeweled throats like stars scattered across a night sky. The scent of beeswax and hothouse roses hung heavy in the warm air, mingling with the subtle notes of lavender water and expensive French perfumes that clung to the assembled ladies. Musicians positioned on a raised dais at the far end of the room coaxed elegant melodies from violin, cello and pianoforte, the notes floating above the steady murmur of conversation and the rhythmic swish of dancing slippers across polished marble. Miss Penelope Fairfax stood near a fluted marble column, partially obscured by an elaborate arrangement of white lilies in a Chinese porcelain vase. Her gloved fingers moved methodically, counting the embroidered petals on her lilac silk gown. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, start again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The repetitive motion calmed the anxiety that threatened to overwhelm her whenever she found herself surrounded by the incomprehensible chaos of polite society. At 26 years of age, Penelope had attended 3 full London seasons without receiving a single marriage proposal. She understood, with the same clinical clarity she applied to botanical classifications, precisely why this was so. She did not possess the seemingly innate gift for saying pleasant untruths that other young ladies wielded with such effortless grace. She could not comprehend the elaborate dance of implication and suggestion that governed what passed for polite conversation among the ton. Most damaging of all, she had the unfortunate and apparently uncontrollable habit of correcting factual errors regardless of social consequence, a tendency that had cost her more potential suitors than her mother cared to enumerate. Tonight would likely end no differently than all the others, with her mother, Lady Margaret Fairfax's disappointment hanging heavy as winter fog over the carriage ride home, and Penelope retreating to the blessed sanctuary of their library at Fairfax Manor, where books did not require her to interpret hidden meanings or guess at unspoken expectations. If stories of love that sees beyond society's narrow definitions and celebrates the courage to remain authentically oneself touch your heart, subscribe now and join us on this journey. You will not want to miss what happens next. Behind Penelope, she could hear her mother's voice rising in barely concealed exasperation as she spoke with Mrs. Beatrice Cunningham, a neighbor whose 3 daughters had all made excellent matches before their 20th birthdays. The conversation drifted to Penelope's ears in fragments, each one a tiny knife of familiar disappointment. "I simply cannot understand it, Beatrice," Lady Margaret was saying, her tone carrying that particular quality of strained patience that Penelope had learned to recognize from earliest childhood. "Penelope is not unattractive. Her dowry is quite respectable for a viscount's daughter. She plays the pianoforte adequately, and her watercolors have been praised by our drawing master. Yet season after season, nothing. Not a single gentleman shows sustained interest beyond an initial dance or two." Mrs. Cunningham's reply was lost in the swell of music as a new set began, but Penelope did not need to hear it. She knew precisely what the woman would say, or some variation thereof. Poor dear Penelope, so peculiar in her manner. Such a trial for you, Margaret. Have you considered lowering your expectations? Perhaps a country parson or a widower in need of a capable household manager? Penelope had heard it all before, in whispers and sympathetic murmurs, in well-meaning advice and thinly veiled criticism. At 26, she was firmly established as a spinster, that pitiable creature who existed on the margins of society, neither girl nor matron, unmarried and therefore incomplete in the eyes of the world that defined her worth solely through her ability to secure a husband. The evening had begun with what Lady Margaret insisted on calling promise, though Penelope privately classified it as maternal optimism, unsupported by observed fact. Her mother had selected the lilac silk gown with great care, spending over an hour in consultation with the modiste on the proper shade to complement Penelope's dark brown hair and grey eyes. The colour, Lady Margaret had declared with immense satisfaction, softened Penelope's features and made her appear more approachable, more feminine, more like the sort of young lady gentlemen sought as wives. What specific features required softening remained a mystery to Penelope. She possessed the same general arrangement of eyes, nose and mouth as other women. Her features were regular if unremarkable, She had been told her eyes were intelligent, though the person offering this observation had not sounded entirely complimentary. Intelligence, it seemed, was not considered an asset when assessing a woman's marriageability. Nor could Penelope understand how fabric color might fundamentally alter one's approachability. Approachability, she reasoned, depended far more upon behavior and demeanor than upon the specific quality of light reflected by one's gown. But she had learned through years of painful experience not to request clarification on such statements. They invariably led to her mother sighing deeply, pressing delicate fingertips to her temples, and murmuring something about headaches and the particular trials of motherhood. Penelope's two younger sisters, both now married and established with their respective husbands, had possessed an instinctive understanding of society's elaborate and unwritten rules. Charlotte, now Mrs. Reginald Hartwell of a considerable estate in Derbyshire, had made what everyone agreed was a brilliant match at the tender age of 19. Sophia, married to Mr. James Clifford, the younger son of an earl with excellent prospects in diplomacy, had secured her position at 21 after a whirlwind courtship that had set tongues wagging with delight throughout Hampshire. Neither sister had ever needed to have the intricacies of flirtation or the subtleties of appropriate conversation explained to them in laborious detail. They simply knew, the way birds knew to fly south for winter or flowers knew to turn their faces toward the sun. The knowledge seemed to exist in their bones, an instinct Penelope entirely lacked. She did not know. She required explicit instruction, step-by-step explanations that broke down every gesture and phrase into comprehensible components, and even then, she frequently failed in execution. It was, she had come to understand, rather like attempting to read a book written in a language one had never properly learned. The individual words looked familiar enough, but their true meaning, when strung together into sentences and paragraphs, remained frustratingly, maddeningly opaque. Lord Richard Jameson had approached her during the first quadrille of the evening, a gentleman of 28 with considerable property in Kent, and what Penelope's mother had breathlessly described as excellent prospects. He stood tall, well above 6 feet, and possessed regular features rendered handsome by careful grooming and fashionably styled auburn hair that glinted copper in the candlelight. His evening coat of dark blue superfine fit his broad shoulders admirably, tailored with precision that spoke of an expensive London tailor. His waistcoat, however, was a vivid shade of green that reminded Penelope unpleasantly of the algae and duckweed that collected on the surface of stagnant pond water in late summer, slick and unwholesome. The color, combined with his particular complexion, which had warm undertones, created an unfortunate effect that rendered his skin sallow and slightly jaundiced in appearance. He had executed what she supposed was meant to be an elegant bow, though his movement struck her as rather exaggerated, like an actor playing to the back rows of a theatre. "Miss Fairfax," he had begun, his voice carrying clearly above the music, pitched louder than strictly necessary for their proximity. "Might I have the very great honor of claiming this dance with the loveliest lady in the room?" Penelope had considered the request with her characteristic thoroughness. She did not particularly wish to dance, as she often lost count of steps during the more complicated patterns, and had a regrettable tendency to tread upon her partner's feet with sufficient force to cause actual pain. Moreover, she doubted his assessment of her as the loveliest lady present, given that Miss Arabella Montrose stood not 10 feet away in a gown of celestial blue that set off her golden curls to magnificent advantage. However, refusing Lord Jameson's request would displease her mother, who was watching the exchange with barely concealed hope from across the room. Lord Jameson had asked with appropriate politeness, even if his compliment was transparently false. Social convention dictated acceptance. "If you wish to dance with me, I am willing," she had replied honestly, setting aside the leather-bound volume of botanical illustrations she had been examining, whilst other young ladies giggled behind painted fans and cast flirtatious glances at passing gentlemen. "Though I should inform you in the interest of full disclosure that I often lose count during complicated steps and frequently tread upon my partner's feet. I do not mean to cause injury, but it happens with distressing regularity. My dancing master once suggested I might consider directing my efforts to pursuits requiring less coordination." Lord Jameson had laughed, a booming sound that startled a nearby couple and caused the lady's punch cup to slosh precariously. "My dear Miss Fairfax, how delightfully refreshing to encounter such charming honesty in this age of artifice. I assure you, I have survived far worse tribulations than a young lady's slipper upon my instep. Why, at Almack's last season, Lady Caroline Winters nearly broke my toe, and she weighs considerably more than your delicate frame." Penelope had not been jesting about her poor dancing, but correcting his misapprehension seemed unnecessarily complicated and likely to create awkwardness. She had allowed him to lead her onto the floor, where couples were already arranging themselves for the quadrille. The dance had proceeded adequately for the first several minutes. Lord Jameson proved to be a competent, if unimaginative, dancer, his steps technically correct, but lacking the fluid grace that marked truly skilled performers. He had an unfortunate habit of humming along with the music, his voice slightly off-key in a manner that set Penelope's teeth on edge. She found this distracting but did not mention it, as her mother had specifically instructed her before the ball not to offer unsolicited criticisms during dances, no matter how constructive or well-intended. It was when they reached the promenade section of the dance, walking side by side whilst other couples performed their figures, that Lord Jameson made his fatal error. He asked, with what Penelope recognized as an attempt at flattery and polite conversation, whether she found the evening's entertainment to her liking. She had been taught, repeatedly and with increasing desperation, that such questions required polite, affirmative responses, regardless of one's actual opinion. "Oh yes, everything is lovely," would suffice, or perhaps, "Lady Merryweather has outdone herself." Even a simple, "How delightful," delivered with an appropriate smile, would serve. Unfortunately, the gap between what Penelope intellectually knew she should say and what actually emerged from her mouth often proved as unbridgeable as the English Channel. "The musicians are competent," she had answered after careful consideration, tilting her head to better assess the string section. "Though I fear the second violinist is consistently flat on the higher notes, which creates a discord that I find rather grating to the ear. The high-vaulted ceiling of this room exaggerates the problem. It would sound better in a space with better resonance. The refreshments appear acceptable in presentation, though I found the lemonade contains far too much sugar for my personal preference. I suspect the cook was attempting to mask inferior quality lemons with excessive sweetness, a common enough practice, but one that does a disservice to those of us who prefer more balanced flavors." She had paused, noticing Lord Jameson's expression growing increasingly rigid, but the observation about his waistcoat seemed too important not to share. After all, she reasoned, would she not wish someone to inform her if she were wearing something unflattering? "And your waistcoat, if I may offer an observation in the spirit of helpful honesty, is a shade of green that unfortunately renders your complexion rather sallow and unwell. The yellow undertones in that particular green clash quite badly with the warm undertones in your skin. I would suggest earth tones in future, perhaps a warm brown or a deep amber, which would prove significantly more flattering for someone of your particular coloring. It is a matter of artistic harmony, you understand. Quite scientific, really. Complementary colors enhance, whilst clashing tones detract. You have excellent bone structure, truly, but the wrong colors can entirely undermine one's best features." Lord Jameson's smile had frozen upon his face like ice crystallizing on a winter window. His jaw worked as though he were chewing something extremely tough. His steps faltered mid-pattern, and he trod heavily upon the hem of Penelope's gown, though she politely pretended not to notice, even as she felt stitches pop beneath her slipper. "My waistcoat," he had repeated slowly, his voice tight with some emotion Penelope could not quite identify. Anger, perhaps? Or embarrassment? She had never mastered reading the subtle facial expressions that betrayed such feelings. "You find my waistcoat unflattering?" "The color is quite unfortunate, yes," Penelope had confirmed, pleased that he seemed to understand. "But you should not feel badly about it. Many gentlemen lack knowledge of artistic harmony. It is not taught as part of a classical education, which I have always thought rather remiss. Understanding how colors interact would prevent such easily avoidable errors. With your warm coloring, any of the earth tones would serve beautifully. Even a deep burgundy would be superior to that particular green." The music had continued, but Lord Jameson had guided her rather forcefully off the floor before the dance could properly conclude, his hand gripping her elbow with more pressure than seemed strictly necessary. He had delivered her to her mother with a smile so tight it looked painful, teeth bared in what might charitably be called a grimace, murmured something about suddenly remembering a prior engagement with a gentleman in the card room, and disappeared into the crowd with impressive speed for a man who, Penelope now noticed, was limping slightly from where she had accidentally stepped upon his instep during the second figure. Lady Margaret's face had cycled through several expressions in rapid succession, each one clearly legible, even to Penelope's normally unreliable skills at reading emotion. Confusion gave way to dawning comprehension, which transformed into disappointment, which finally settled into that particular expression of weary resignation that had become increasingly familiar over the past 3 seasons. Penelope. Her mother's voice had carried that particular quality that indicated a lecture was imminent. What precisely did you say to Lord Jameson? He departed, looking rather as though he had swallowed something extremely unpleasant. Penelope had replayed the entire conversation in her mind with the careful attention she might apply to reviewing experimental results. I provided helpful observations regarding his unfortunate choice of waistcoat and offered honest counsel about the musical performance and the quality of the refreshments. I was attempting to be useful. Was that incorrect? Darling. Lady Margaret had closed her eyes briefly, a gesture Penelope had witnessed so many times she had lost count. One hand rose to press delicate fingertips against her temple. Did you perhaps consider that a gentleman attempting to court you does not wish to hear his waistcoat criticized, whilst he is actively trying to impress you? Penelope had considered this novel piece of information, turning it over in her mind like an interesting rock one might examine for hidden properties. But the information was accurate and potentially valuable. Would it not be more helpful for him to know about the unflattering color, so that he might select more flattering attire in future and thus improve his prospects with other young ladies? I was attempting to be kind, truly. Surely allowing him to continue wearing colors that make him look ill would be the unkind course of action. Would you not wish someone to tell you if your gown was unflattering? Truth and kindness, her mother had said slowly and carefully, as though explaining an extremely complex concept to a small child, are not always the same thing, my dearest girl. Sometimes, often in fact, kindness requires remaining silent about truths that might wound or embarrass, even if those truths are objectively accurate. This statement made no logical sense whatsoever to Penelope. Truth and kindness were separate concepts that existed independently of one another. One could be truthful and kind simultaneously. One could be truthful and cruel. One could be dishonest and kind. One could be dishonest and cruel. But to suggest that kindness inherently required dishonesty, or that remaining silent about useful information constituted kindness, seemed a fundamental misunderstanding of both concepts. She had, however, learned through years of fruitless attempts that arguing such philosophical points with her mother led nowhere productive, and generally resulted in both of them feeling frustrated and misunderstood. Instead, she had excused herself to the terrace, explaining that the heat and press of so many bodies in the ballroom had given her a headache. This was not entirely false. The sensory assault of too much noise layered upon too much light, layered upon too many conflicting perfumes and colognes, had indeed produced a dull, persistent ache behind her eyes that threatened to blossom into something truly painful if she did not retreat soon. The terrace offered blessed relief. Cool evening air, carrying the scent of roses from the gardens below, caressed her overheated skin like a benediction. The noise of the ballroom faded to a more manageable murmur, voices and music muted by stone walls and distance. Above, stars scattered across the dark velvet of the sky in patterns Penelope had studied and memorized, their positions as reliable as old friends. Ursa Major, the Great Bear, Cassiopeia, the queen upon her throne, Orion, the hunter, though only partially visible at this time of year. She traced the familiar constellations with her eyes, feeling the tension begin to drain from her shoulders. Stars, at least, behaved according to comprehensible rules. They followed predictable paths across the heavens. They did not say one thing whilst meaning another. They did not require interpretation or careful navigation of unspoken social codes. She was counting visible stars in Cassiopeia, finding comfort in the simple meditative repetition of numbers, when a deep voice spoke from the shadows near the terrace doors. "Do you prefer the stars to the company within, Miss Fairfax?" Penelope started, her heart leaping in her chest. She turned quickly to find a tall figure emerging from the darkness, his form resolving into distinct features as he moved into the light cast by the terrace lanterns. Even before she could see his face clearly, she recognized him by his bearing, the particular way he held himself with a combination of aristocratic confidence and deep weariness. Lord Sebastian Thorne, Marquess of Windermere. She had not seen him in nearly a year, not since her father Viscount Fairfax's funeral the previous autumn. He had stood throughout that terrible day, silent and separate from the other mourners, positioned at the edge of the gathering like a sentinel. His expression had been as cold and remote as carved marble, his dark eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance that only he could see, apparently unmoved by the words of comfort or the tears of those around him. He had been her father's closest friend since their university days at Cambridge, an unlikely friendship that had survived more than 3 decades despite their vastly different temperaments. Her father had been warm, gregarious, quick to laugh, and generous with his affection. Lord Windermere was his opposite in nearly every respect, reserved to the point of seeming cold, rarely seen at social gatherings, and possessed of a reputation for brilliant business acumen paired with what society whispered was absolute emotional detachment. The friendship had begun at Cambridge over a shared love of classical literature, her father had once told her, and had endured because each man possessed qualities the other lacked but admired. Where her father had been all heart, Sebastian Thorne had been all head. Together they had balanced one another, or so it had been, until Lady Helena Thorne had died in childbed 10 years prior, taking her infant son with her into death. After that tragedy, Sebastian had withdrawn from society almost entirely, maintaining only the bare minimum of social presence required by his title and business interests. "Stars do not require interpretation," Penelope answered honestly, too exhausted from the evening's disasters to attempt polite evasions or careful deflections. They simply exist in their designated positions. One need not wonder what a star truly means when it shines, or whether one has inadvertently offended it through some subtle social transgression of which one remains entirely ignorant. Lord Windermere moved closer, his footsteps nearly silent on the stone terrace. Penelope could see his face more clearly now in the golden light of the lanterns. He was 39 years old, she knew from her father's conversations, though his face suggested both younger and older than those years. Younger in the classical symmetry of his features, the strong, clean line of his jaw, the well-formed architecture of high cheekbones and a straight nose that spoke of excellent breeding. Older in the deep lines that bracketed his mouth, the permanent furrow carved between his dark brows, and the liberal threading of silver through hair that had once been pure black. He had been handsome once, she thought. He was still handsome now, in the way a winter landscape was handsome. Cold, remote, beautiful but entirely uninviting, all sharp edges and frozen surfaces that warned against approach. "A fair observation," he said quietly, his voice carrying the cultured tones of expensive education and good breeding. "Stars are admirably straightforward in their behavior. They follow predictable paths according to immutable natural laws. There is profound comfort in such reliability, is there not? One can calculate their positions with mathematical precision. They will not surprise you with unexpected volatility. Unlike people," Penelope added, grateful to encounter someone who seemed to truly understand rather than merely offering polite agreement. "Quite unlike people," he concurred, moving to stand beside her at the terrace balustrade. "People are chaos masquerading as order. They say one thing whilst meaning another entirely. They smile whilst simultaneously calculating how best to wound you. They profess friendship and affection whilst preparing betrayal. Stars, by contrast, are honest. Brutally, refreshingly honest. I confess I find your manner quite restful compared to the noise within." There was bitterness in his voice, old and deep, like a well that had been poisoned years ago, but never cleared. The pain in those words was so raw, so evident, that even Penelope, with her normally unreliable ability to read emotional nuance, could hear it clearly. She wondered at its source, but knew instinctively that inquiring would be unwelcome. Her inability to read social cues did not extend to missing such obvious signs of ancient wounds, even if she did not always know how to respond appropriately to them. They stood together in companionable silence for several long moments. Penelope found it a remarkably comfortable silence, which was unusual enough to be noteworthy. Most silences in company made her profoundly anxious, as she could never determine with any certainty if she was expected to fill them with conversation, and, if so, what sort of conversation would be deemed appropriate for the specific social context. Her attempts at small talk so often led to awkwardness or unintended offense that she had learned to dread the responsibility of maintaining discourse. But this silence with Lord Windermere felt different, natural, peaceful, as though both of them were simply existing in the same physical space, without requiring performance or pretense, without the exhausting necessity of maintaining social masks. It was Lord Windermere who eventually broke the quiet. "Your father spoke of you often," he said, his gaze fixed on the same stars Penelope had been observing moments before. "With immense pride and affection, he would read me passages from your letters, describing your latest botanical discoveries, with such enthusiasm that one would think you had uncovered lost treasure from antiquity rather than a new variety of rose." Warmth bloomed in Penelope's chest at the mention of her beloved father, though it carried the inevitable shadow of grief. "Did he truly share my letters with you? I know he humored my interests, but I sometimes wondered if he found them tedious. My mother certainly does. She tolerates my botanical work, the way one tolerates a child's less harmful eccentricities, with patient forbearance tempered by hope that I might eventually grow out of such peculiar obsessions." "Tedious?" Lord Windermere turned to look at her fully, and something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "My dear Miss Fairfax, your father considered your scientific mind one of the great achievements of his life. He said repeatedly that you possessed the sort of rigorous intellectual curiosity and methodical analytical capacity that would have made you a brilliant scholar at Cambridge or Oxford, had you been born male and thus permitted access to such institutions." "Had I been born male," Penelope said with a touch of bitterness she rarely allowed herself to express aloud, "I would have been permitted to attend university, yes, to pursue formal scientific education, to publish scholarly work under my own name without requiring male sponsorship, to be valued for my intellect rather than pitied for my unmarried state, and criticized for my peculiar interests and my inability to navigate society's incomprehensible rules. The world is profoundly unjust in its distribution of opportunities," Lord Windermere observed with quiet intensity, "though I suspect you make far better use of your limited resources and restricted circumstances than most men make of their unlimited advantages and unrestricted access. Your father shared with me several of your detailed botanical observations. Your methodology is sound, your documentation meticulous, your conclusions well-reasoned. Any university would be fortunate to claim such rigorous scholarship, regardless of the gender of the scholar producing it." Penelope turned to study him more carefully, searching his face for signs of the polite dishonesty that so often characterized compliments. She found none. His expression remained serious, his eyes steady on hers, without the evasive flickering that usually accompanied insincere flattery. "That is extraordinarily kind of you to say, my lord," she said slowly, "though I confess surprise at finding you here this evening. My father mentioned on several occasions that you had not attended a society event since your wife's passing, save for the most unavoidable obligations. He said you found such gatherings painful." His expression shuttered immediately, features transforming into that cold marble mask she had witnessed at her father's funeral. The softness vanished as though it had never existed. "Your mother extended an invitation I could not politely refuse, given my long friendship with your father and the debt of affection I owe his memory. It seemed the behavior expected of a gentleman to make an appearance, to pay my respects to his widow and daughters. Duty demanded I attend. But you would rather be elsewhere." "I would rather be almost anywhere," he admitted with surprising candor, his voice flat. "I attend perhaps 3 or 4 such events per year, solely to maintain the barest minimum of social presence required of my title and position. I find no pleasure in them whatsoever. They are obligation, nothing more." Nor do I find pleasure in such gatherings, Penelope confessed, though I suspect my reasons differ from yours. Perhaps not so different as you might think, Miss Fairfax. He turned to face her fully, and in the lantern light his eyes held an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. Tell me, have you continued cataloguing the Hampshire flora as you described in your correspondence to your father? The letters he shared with me detailed your discovery of what you believed to be natural rose hybrids. Have you confirmed that theory? Penelope's eyes widened. You read my letters. My father shared them with you. Only the portions relating to your botanical work, and only after receiving your permission, which he claimed to have secured, though I confess I have no independent verification of that claim. But yes, he shared extensively. He was inordinately proud of your systematic approach and your discovery of those hybrid roses. He said it demonstrated original thinking of the highest caliber. Enthusiasm overcame Penelope's usual reticence, as it invariably did when someone showed genuine interest in her work. Words tumbled out in a rush. I have now identified 47 distinct species in our gardens and the surrounding parkland at Fairfax Manor, including 3 varieties of rosa that do not appear in any published botanical text I have consulted, and I have access to my father's quite extensive library on the subject. I believe they may indeed be natural hybrids, the result of cross-pollination between cultivated garden roses and wild varieties that grow along our property boundaries, where the formal gardens transition to woodland. She paused to draw breath, then continued with growing excitement. I have been observing them systematically through 2 complete growing seasons now, documenting bloom times with precision, analyzing petal structure and count, recording qualities of scent at different times of day and under varying weather conditions, and monitoring their resistance to common rose diseases, such as black spot and powdery mildew. The data strongly supports the theory of crossbreeding. They exhibit characteristics of both parent species in predictable patterns consistent with the principles of hereditary traits, though the specific mechanisms remain a subject of much debate among naturalists. Most people's eyes glazed over when Penelope discussed her botanical work with any degree of technical specificity. Her sisters had learned to nod politely, whilst clearly thinking of other matters entirely, their attention wandering within moments. Her mother listened with strained, martyred patience before inevitably changing the subject to more appropriate ladylike accomplishments such as needlework or watercolors or the proper management of household accounts. Lord Windermere, however, appeared not merely politely interested but genuinely engaged. He asked, "Natural hybrids occurring without human intervention are quite uncommon, are they not? I had understood the process required carefully controlled cultivation by an experienced horticulturist." "They are exceptionally uncommon, yes, though not impossible given the right circumstances," Penelope explained, grateful for his genuine curiosity. "The conditions must be remarkably precise for successful hybridization to occur spontaneously in nature without human guidance. First, the parent plants must bloom simultaneously, which requires compatible genetic timing and similar responses to environmental triggers such as temperature and day length. Second, appropriate pollinators, typically bees or other nectar-feeding insects, must transfer pollen from the stamens of one plant to the pistil of another, with sufficient efficiency and in sufficient quantity to ensure fertilization. She warmed to her subject, her hands moving expressively as she spoke. Third, the resulting seeds must then find appropriate conditions for germination, requiring proper soil composition, adequate moisture, appropriate light levels, and protection from predation by birds or rodents. Finally, the hybrid offspring must prove robust enough to thrive and capable of surviving to maturity and potentially reproducing in turn. When one considers all the variables that must align perfectly, often against significant odds, for such an event to occur, it truly is rather miraculous. The probability is vanishingly small, yet it does occasionally happen. Rather like genuine human connection, Lord Windermere observed quietly. Penelope had not considered the comparison, but found it remarkably apt upon reflection. Yes, I suppose the parallel is quite strong. So many variables must align for authentic connection to occur between two people. compatible temperaments and interests, appropriate timing in both parties' lives, circumstances that allow for meaningful interaction, mutual willingness to invest effort in cultivating the relationship, physical proximity, or at least regular communication, shared values, or complementary differences. The probability that all these factors will coincide perfectly is quite low. She hesitated, then added with painful honesty, "No wonder I find it so remarkably, consistently difficult. I seem to lack whatever instinct allows other people to navigate the process successfully." "You find connection difficult?" His tone held genuine curiosity rather than judgment, which was itself unusual enough to be noteworthy. "Do you not?" She tilted her head, studying him with the same careful, analytical attention she might apply to an interesting botanical specimen presenting unusual characteristics. "My father told me you have not attended a society event in years, save for the most unavoidable obligations tied to your title. You maintain the absolute minimum of social presence. You live alone at Windmere Park, with only your staff of servants, seeing almost no one, accepting almost no invitations. That pattern of behavior suggests you find human connection either profoundly difficult or deeply distasteful, or quite possibly both." "Your observational skills are formidable, Miss Fairfax," he said, and there might have been approval in his voice. "You have not actually answered the question." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "I find most human connection shallow and performative, yes. People wear elaborate masks and play carefully rehearsed roles. They say what society expects rather than what truth demands. They value appearance over substance, reputation over character, social advantage over genuine affection. I confess I have extremely little patience for such elaborate theatre. Then why engage in it at all, even minimally? Because complete isolation invites excessive speculation and gossip that can materially damage one's business interests and impair one's ability to manage one's estates effectively," he replied with pragmatic honesty. "Because my title carries certain unavoidable responsibilities that occasionally require social performance, regardless of personal preference. Because your mother would have been wounded had I refused her invitation entirely, and I owed your father the courtesy of kindness to his widow in her bereavement." Penelope considered this response carefully. "Those are all external motivations imposed by circumstance and obligation. You have not mentioned a single longing of the spirit, any genuine wish for human company beyond what duty demands." "No," he agreed quietly, his voice carrying undertones of something that might have been pain or possibly just profound weariness. "I have not mentioned such desires because I possess none. I am content, perhaps even relieved, to live without the complications that connection inevitably brings." Before Penelope could formulate a response to this startling admission, her mother's voice called from the doorway behind them, bright with forced cheer. "Penelope, there you are, my dear. I have been searching everywhere. Lady Ashcroft has expressed particular interest in meeting you. She heard of your watercolors from Mrs. Montrose and wishes to discuss them with you." Penelope recognized a maternal maneuver when she encountered one. Lady Ashcroft had 3 unmarried sons ranging from 25 to 32 years of age, all of whom her mother had doubtless researched thoroughly. This was clearly an attempt to arrange an introduction that might, with luck and divine intervention, lead somewhere productive. Lord Windmere bowed with formal courtesy. "Miss Fairfax, I very much hope we might continue our discussion of botanical hybridization and natural selection at some future time. I find the subject genuinely fascinating, and your approach to systematic observation is remarkably sophisticated." "I would like that very much indeed," Penelope said honestly, and was rewarded with what might have been actual warmth in his dark eyes, a softening of that cold marble mask, before he turned and disappeared into the shadows beyond the circle of lantern light. She watched him go with an odd sensation blooming in her chest, something unfamiliar and difficult to name or categorize. It was only as her mother took her elbow and began guiding her back inside that Penelope identified the components of this strange new feeling: disappointment at his departure, sharp and immediate; hope for his promised return, tentative but growing; and beneath both, pushing up through her carefully guarded heart like a seedling through soil, a tiny nascent possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, she had found someone who spoke her particular language, someone who did not require her to translate herself into acceptable forms, someone who might value precision over platitude and truth over performance, someone, in short, who might actually understand her. The following 3 weeks brought an unexpected development that disrupted Penelope's carefully ordered life. Lord Windermere began calling at Fairfax Manor with increasing frequency, appearing at their door at least 3 or 4 times each week. He claimed initially to have business matters to discuss with Penelope's elder brother Edmund regarding neighbouring estate boundaries and shared water rights, drainage issues that affected both properties. These discussions indeed occurred, conducted in her father's study, whilst Penelope attempted to concentrate on her botanical notes in the library. But Edmund's business never seemed to require more than 20 or 30 minutes of Lord Windermere's time. The remaining hours of each visit, sometimes extending well into late afternoon, were invariably spent in the gardens where Penelope could be found with her botanical notebooks, magnifying glass, and careful sketches of plant structures. Their conversations flowed with an ease Penelope had never experienced with anyone save her beloved father. Lord Windermere did not seem to mind, did not appear even slightly bored or impatient when she spoke at considerable length about pistil structure or the superior qualities of proper Linnaean nomenclature over common names. He asked thoughtful, intelligent questions that demonstrated genuine curiosity and actually listened to her answers with focused attention rather than merely waiting with visible impatience for his turn to speak. On one particularly warm afternoon in early July, they sat together on a stone bench in the rose garden, surrounded by blooms in various stages of opening. Penelope had been explaining her documentation system, showing him her meticulous notebooks with their dated entries, detailed sketches, and careful observations recorded in her precise hand. "Your methodology is remarkably rigorous," Sebastian observed, studying a page covered with measurements and notes. "This would satisfy the standards of any scientific journal. The level of detail is extraordinary." "Yet no scientific journal would publish it," Penelope said with matter-of-fact bitterness. "I am a woman. My work, regardless of its quality or merit, would be dismissed without consideration simply because of my sex. The only way to publish would be under a male pseudonym or with a male sponsor willing to claim the work as his own, and I confess, I find both options rather galling." "That is profoundly unjust." "It is factual," she corrected gently. "Justice and fact are not always aligned, more's the pity. I have learned to accept this limitation and find satisfaction in the work itself, rather than in any hope of recognition or publication." He was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Finally he said, "Your father would have fought for your work to be recognized, you know." He spoke more than once of his frustration with society's barriers to female scholarship. "He thought you brilliant." "My father was a remarkable man," Penelope said softly, feeling the familiar ache of grief. "He never made me feel peculiar or defective for my interests or my manner. My mother loves me. I know she does deeply and truly, but she wishes I were different, more like my sisters Charlotte and Sophia. They understand society's elaborate rules instinctively, the way one might understand one's native language. I must have every rule explained to me explicitly, and even then I often fail spectacularly in execution." "Perhaps," Lord Windermere said carefully, his voice gentle, "society's rules are not as worthy of mastery as botanical classification. Perhaps the failure lies not in you, but in the arbitrary nature of the rules themselves." "You are extraordinarily kind to suggest so, but we both know that perspective does not reflect reality. My sisters are both happily married to good men who value them. They have established households and growing families. They have achieved what society expects of women. I am 26 years old and firmly relegated to the shelf, as the saying goes. My failure to master social rules has had material consequences for my life prospects and my future." "Their loss," Sebastian said quietly, "is most assuredly botany's gain. And possibly," he added with the faintest ghost of a smile, "my gain as well. Had you married some country squire at 19, I would be deprived of these conversations, which I confess I have come to value more than I can adequately express." Penelope felt warmth spreading through her chest, a sensation she could not quite name, but which felt significant. She found herself looking forward to Lord Windermere's visits with an anticipation that seemed to exist somewhere deeper than mere intellectual appreciation. When she woke in the morning, her first thought was often whether he might call that day. When she worked in the garden, she found herself listening for his distinctive footsteps on the gravel path. This preoccupation troubled her. She did not have a framework for understanding these feelings, no previous experience to provide context or interpretation. It was during one such visit in mid-July, as they sat in her father's library discussing the merits of the Linnaean classification system, that Penelope's world shifted on its axis in a way she had not anticipated and could not have prevented. She had been searching for a particular volume on upper shelves, a rare French text on rose cultivation that her father had acquired years ago. Standing on the small rolling ladder that her father had commissioned specifically for reaching high shelves, she stretched upward, her fingers just brushing the spine of the desired book. It was then that she heard voices in the corridor outside. The library door stood slightly ajar, and sound traveled with unfortunate clarity through the opening. She recognized the first voice immediately as belonging to Mr. Horace Blackwell, their nearest neighbor and her father's longtime friend. The second voice took a moment to place, but she identified it as her brother Edmund. "Sebastian visits with remarkable frequency these days," Mr. Blackwell was saying, his tone carrying poorly concealed curiosity. "One might even suspect he has developed a romantic tendre for your sister Penelope. Has he made his intentions known?" Penelope's hand froze on the book spine. Her breath stopped in her chest. She knew with absolute certainty, born of bitter experience, that she should make her presence known immediately, should cough or shift position to alert them that their conversation was not private. She remained silent, frozen on the ladder, hating herself, but unable to move. The worn leather of the book binding felt slick against her palm, and the heavy volume seemed to increase in weight with every passing second, becoming a burden she could barely sustain. Her brother Edmund's voice came clearly through the gap. "Sebastian is kind to call so regularly, given his close friendship with father, but I cannot imagine he harbors serious romantic intentions toward Penelope. She is far too complicated for a man like Windermere. He values order, precision, and clarity above all else, in both business and personal matters. Penelope is neither ordered nor clear in her communication style. She offends people without realizing, speaks too bluntly, misses obvious social cues. No, I imagine he visits primarily out of duty to father's memory, perhaps with some genuine enjoyment of her botanical knowledge, but nothing more serious than that." The words struck like physical blows. Too complicated, neither ordered nor clear, nothing more serious. "Pity," Mr. Blackwell replied. "She could certainly use a husband's guidance and protection. At her age, prospects grow increasingly limited. She needs a patient man." Edmund agreed, his tone frustratingly reasonable. "Someone willing to tolerate her peculiarities and explain social situations to her repeatedly, without frustration. Someone who finds her directness charming rather than off-putting. Sebastian is many admirable things, but patient with disorder and confusion is not among them. He would find her exhausting within a fortnight." Their voices faded as they moved away down the corridor, leaving Penelope alone with the echoes of their assessment. She remained frozen on the ladder, the forgotten book still just out of reach. Her chest felt tight, as though someone had laced her stays too severely, constricting her ability to draw breath. The warmth she had felt in Sebastian's presence now seemed foolish, a naive misinterpretation of kindness for something deeper and more significant. Of course he did not harbor romantic feelings. How could he? She was complicated, disordered, peculiar. Everything a man like the Marquess of Windermere, with his reputation for brilliant precision and emotional control, would find intolerable in a wife. She descended the ladder carefully, her movements mechanical. She closed the forgotten book, carefully reshelved it, and left the library through the garden door. She could not face Lord Windermere now, could not pretend she had not heard the truth of how she was perceived, how their growing friendship was interpreted by those who knew them both. When a footman found Lord Windermere in the library some minutes later and informed him that Miss Fairfax had been called away suddenly on an urgent domestic matter, he departed with a frown creasing his brow. But Penelope remained hidden in the conservatory, counting the panes of glass in the roof over and over, until she was certain his carriage had left the drive. The following days brought a notable absence of the Marquess. Penelope told herself this provided evidence that her brother had been correct. Lord Windermere's visits had been duty and perhaps intellectual curiosity, nothing more. Now that those obligations had been sufficiently discharged, he had returned to his preferred isolation. She tried desperately to return to her botanical work with the same absorption and enthusiasm that had always sustained her, but she found herself distracted, staring at blank pages in her notebook without recording observations, counting flower petals obsessively whenever anxiety rose in her throat like bile. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Start again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It was her mother who insisted, with gentle but immovable determination, that she attend Lady Ashcroft's dinner party the following week. Penelope had attempted every reasonable argument against attendance, citing headaches, fatigue, and pressing botanical work that required immediate attention. Lady Margaret had remained firm. "You cannot hide in the conservatory and gardens forever, darling. I know society is difficult and often painful for you, but you must make an effort. You must continue to be seen, to present yourself as available and open to connection. Otherwise, you condemn yourself to permanent spinsterhood." The dinner party promised to be every bit as uncomfortable as Penelope had anticipated, possibly worse. She was seated beside a young gentleman, Mr. Arthur Stockworth, who spoke at tedious length about his hunting prowess, detailing every successful shot and missed opportunity with exhausting specificity. When he finally paused to consume several mouthfuls of roasted pheasant and asked her opinion of blood sports, Penelope made the fundamental error of responding honestly. "I find the concept of killing animals for sport rather illogical, if I am to be completely frank," she said. "It strikes me as an inefficient expenditure of time and resources. Expending vast energy, horses and hounds, to chase down a single creature seems a disproportionate effort for the result achieved. Surely if one requires sustenance, a single skilled marksman is the logical solution. The pageantry of the hunt seems to me a misuse of human intelligence, turning a simple necessity into an elaborate and wasteful performance." Mr. Stockworth's face flushed an unbecoming shade of crimson that clashed badly with his ginger hair. His jaw worked soundlessly for several seconds before he turned pointedly away to address the lady on his opposite side with marked enthusiasm. Across the table, Lady Beatrice Ashcroft and her two daughters, Miss Catherine and Miss Margaret Ashcroft, watched the exchange with ill-concealed amusement. Lady Beatrice was known throughout Hampshire for her cutting wit and her daughter's successful matches with wealthy gentlemen. She had always treated Penelope with thinly veiled contempt, as one might regard an unfortunate accident that had occurred in polite company. "Miss Fairfax," Lady Beatrice said sweetly, her voice carrying clearly across the table so that all conversation ceased and every eye turned toward Penelope. "We were discussing Lord Jameson's recent engagement just before dinner. Such delightful news. You danced with him at the Merryweather Ball several weeks past, did you not? Tell us, what particular qualities do you think recommended him so strongly to his fortunate bride? You must have formed some impression during your time together." Penelope felt every eye fix upon her. She understood, with sudden and absolute clarity, that this was not a genuine inquiry motivated by innocent curiosity. Lady Beatrice sought to humiliate her publicly, though Penelope could not fathom why. What had she done to earn such deliberate cruelty from a woman she barely knew? "I am not acquainted with Lord Jameson with sufficient depth or duration to speak knowledgeably to his qualities as a potential husband," Penelope said carefully, choosing each word with precision. "We shared a single dance that did not proceed to completion." "Oh, but surely you must have formed some impression, however brief," Lady Beatrice pressed, her smile widening in a manner that reminded Penelope unpleasantly of a cat toying with an injured mouse. "You are always so refreshingly honest, are you not, Miss Fairfax? So wonderfully direct in your assessments. Come now, be honest with us as you are honest with everyone. What qualities struck you most forcefully about Lord Jameson?" The trap was evident now, though Penelope could see no way to avoid it without appearing deliberately evasive or, worse, rude. "Lord Jameson is tall," she said finally, grasping for objective facts that could not be construed as criticism. He stands well above 6 feet, and he speaks quite loudly with considerable volume that ensures he is heard even in crowded rooms. And he walks with a rapid gait, covering ground quickly and efficiently. The table erupted in cruel laughter. Lady Beatrice's smile transformed into something satisfied. "How utterly charming," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You describe gentlemen as one might describe livestock at market or horses at auction. Height, volume, speed. Do you also evaluate their teeth for soundness, Miss Fairfax? Perhaps check their hooves for cracks?" More laughter rippled around the table. Penelope felt heat rising in her face, that telltale flush of humiliation she had experienced countless times, but never learned to prevent or control. Her hands trembled slightly beneath the table, and she gripped her napkin with both fists, counting the threads with desperate focus. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. "I merely answered your question honestly with observable facts," Penelope said quietly, her voice barely carrying across the suddenly silent table. "I am sorry if my response was deemed inadequate or inappropriate." "Honestly, yes," Lady Beatrice agreed with mock sympathy, but with all the social grace of a dairymaid discussing cattle in the barn. One would think that after 26 years of life and 3 failed London seasons, you might have developed some measure of social refinement, or learned to moderate your unfortunate tendency toward excessive, inappropriate honesty. The words struck with the force of carefully aimed arrows. Each one found its mark with precision, opening wounds Penelope had thought safely scabbed over. 3 failed seasons, social grace of a dairymaid, unfortunate tendency. Penelope's vision blurred slightly at the edges, the faces around the table becoming indistinct shapes swimming in candlelight. The noise of the room, which had fallen silent during Lady Beatrice's attack, now swelled again with resumed conversation, but it sounded distant and distorted, as though she were hearing it from underwater. She needed to leave, needed air and space and silence, needed to count something, anything, to stop the rising wave of panic that threatened to overwhelm her completely. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. In her haste and disorientation, she misjudged the distance between her chair and the table edge. Her sudden movement jostled a footman who was reaching past her shoulder with a fresh tea service, attempting to refill cups for the next course. The tray tilted in the footman's hands. Time seemed to slow as Penelope watched hot tea cascade from the silver pot, arcing through the air in a dark stream that splashed across the pristine white tablecloth. The liquid spread rapidly, soaking into expensive Belgian lace, staining it brown. A cup fell, shattering against a plate, with a sound like a gunshot in the shocked silence. "Forgive me," Penelope whispered, backing away from the table, her hands shaking visibly now. "I did not mean to cause disruption. I am sorry. I am so terribly sorry." "Clearly not intentional," Lady Beatrice said, her tone dripping with false sympathy that somehow made the words more cruel than honest censure would have been. "Though one might reasonably argue that disruption follows you as naturally as grace eludes you, my dear. It seems to be your particular talent." Penelope fled. She heard her mother calling after her, heard the rising murmur of voices discussing what had just occurred, but she could not stop, could not stay, could not endure another moment in that room full of people who viewed her as an object of pity or entertainment or scorn. She burst through the rear doors into Lady Ashcroft's gardens, the cool evening air hitting her face like a benediction. But even the garden was not far enough, not safe enough. She could still hear laughter drifting through the open windows, could still feel the weight of their collective judgment pressing down on her like a physical force. Her feet carried her without conscious direction toward the old oak tree at the garden's far edge, near where manicured lawn gave way to semi-wild woodland. She had climbed this tree as a child during rare visits when Lady Ashcroft and her mother had been closer friends, before Penelope had become too peculiar, too much of an embarrassment for polite company. The familiar branches welcomed her like old friends. Penelope climbed without thought, though the process was far more arduous than in her youth. She had to fight the restriction of her stays and bunch the heavy silk of her skirts in her hands to gain purchase. Her body remembered the path, however, and she settled into the broad fork where the massive trunk split into major limbs, drew her knees to her chest despite the restriction of her evening gown. and finally allowed herself to cry. The tears came with a force that surprised and frightened her. She wept for her father, who had understood and valued her exactly as she was. She wept for her own profound inadequacy, her fundamental inability to navigate a world that made no logical sense, yet punished her relentlessly for failing to master its nonsensical rules. She wept for Lord Windermere's absent kindness, which she had mistaken for something deeper and more significant than mere polite interest in a deceased friend's peculiar daughter. She wept for the loneliness that stretched before her like an endless grey plain. She wept for all the connections she would never make, all the love she would never experience, all the belonging that would forever remain beyond her reach. She was so utterly lost in her misery that she did not hear approaching footsteps until a familiar voice spoke from below, cutting through her sobs. "Miss Fairfax." Penelope froze, her breath catching painfully in her chest. Through tear-blurred vision, she looked down through the network of branches to see Lord Sebastian Thorne standing at the base of the oak tree, his expression impossible to read in the gathering dusk. "Please go away," she managed, hating how thick and choked her voice sounded, how completely she had lost control of her composure. "Come down, Miss Fairfax," he said instead, his voice firm but not unkind. "It has begun to rain. You will catch a chill if you remain exposed to the elements." Indeed, the first drops were already falling, pattering softly against the leaves above her head, with a sound like distant applause. "I prefer the rain and the risk of chill to the company inside that house," Penelope replied with as much dignity as she could muster. "The rain, at least, falls without judgment. It does not mock or belittle. It simply is." "That is entirely understandable given the circumstances," he said calmly. "Lady Ashcroft's behavior was abominable, cruel, and entirely unworthy of anyone claiming to be a gentlewoman. Nevertheless, you will catch a serious chill, and I gave my word to your father that I would protect his daughters to the best of my ability. Therefore, you must come down." "Then I shall catch a chill and suffer the consequences," Penelope said stubbornly. "It matters very little. I am already a disappointment and an embarrassment to my family. Adding illness to my list of failings will change nothing of substance." There was a long silence broken only by the increasing patter of rain on leaves. Then, to her absolute astonishment, she heard the creak of wood and looked down to see Lord Windermere grasping the lowest branch and pulling himself upward with surprising agility. "What are you doing?" Penelope demanded, genuinely shocked. "If you will not come down to safety," he said, his voice slightly strained with effort as he climbed, his expensive evening clothes catching on bark and small branches, "then I shall come up to you. I gave my word to your father, Miss Fairfax. I do not break my word regardless of personal inconvenience." He climbed with methodical efficiency despite the impediment of formal attire, moving from branch to branch until he reached her position. He settled himself on a thick limb near hers, brushing leaves and small twigs from his coat, with apparent unconcern for the expensive fabric, now thoroughly smudged with bark and sap. "You will utterly ruin your clothes," Penelope protested weakly. "Clothes can be replaced. People, particularly people I value, cannot." He turned to look at her directly, his dark eyes serious. "You are crying. I confess I am not skilled at offering comfort, but I am here nonetheless." They sat in silence for several moments, as rain fell more steadily around them, droplets catching in Sebastian's dark hair, making it gleam in the fading light. Water ran down his face and dripped from his nose and chin, but he made no move to seek shelter. "I witnessed what occurred at dinner," Lord Windermere said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I arrived late, hoping to pay my respects to Lady Ashcroft, and discovered you were in attendance. I was standing in the corridor when Lady Ashcroft began her calculated attack. Her behavior was unconscionable, designed specifically to humiliate you before an audience." "She spoke truth," Penelope replied dully, her voice flat with defeat. "I do lack social grace. I describe people like livestock. I cannot navigate the simplest social situation without causing offense or disruption. Every word she said was objectively accurate, even if the manner of delivery was unkind." "She spoke cruelty disguised as truth," Sebastian corrected firmly. You are honest in a world built upon carefully maintained falsehoods. You speak directly in a society that values obfuscation and implication. In a world of substance rather than appearance, your honesty would be valued as the rare and precious commodity it is. In this world, which values performance over authenticity, honesty is perceived as threat by those whose position depends upon maintaining comfortable lies. That is a generous interpretation, but it changes nothing. Honesty has cost me every marriage prospect I might have had. Honesty has rendered me unmarriageable. At 26, I am firmly established on the shelf, as society so delicately phrases it. I am a disappointment to my mother, an embarrassment to my family, and a figure of pity or mockery to everyone who encounters me. Society, Lord Windermere said with quiet but unmistakable intensity, is composed primarily of fools and charlatans who value appearance over substance, who mistake conformity for virtue, and who cannot recognize genuine worth when confronted with it directly. Their judgment means nothing, less than nothing. Yet those fools and charlatans determine my future. Or rather, they determine that I have no future beyond permanent spinsterhood and eventual dependence upon my brother's charity. He was quiet for a long moment, rain soaking through both their clothes now, plastering fabric against skin. When he spoke again, his voice carried an edge of something raw and painful. I heard what you said. What you believe you heard. Penelope went very still. I beg your pardon. Last week, in the corridor outside your father's library, your brother and Mr. Blackwell discussing my visits to Fairfax Manor, discussing my supposed lack of romantic intentions toward you. You overheard their conversation. How did you know? The question emerged as barely a whisper. Because you have avoided me completely since that day. Because when my carriage arrived at Fairfax Manor, you disappeared. Because the ease and comfort that had been developing between us vanished as though it had never existed. I am not skilled at reading subtle emotional cues, Miss Fairfax, but even I could deduce the cause of such an abrupt change. Penelope closed her eyes against the sting of rain and tears. My brother spoke truth. I am too complicated for someone like you, disordered and unclear, exhausting. I would drive you to distraction within a fortnight. Your brother spoke, Lord Windermere said slowly and carefully, and I heard his words that day as I stood frozen in the hallway, listening as he catalogued what he perceived as your inadequacies and my incompatibilities. But you, Miss Fairfax, fundamentally misunderstand the nature of my silence in response. You did not contradict him. No, I did not, but not because I agreed with his assessment. I said nothing because speaking, because defending you and declaring my true feelings in that moment to your brother and his companion would have required me to admit what I have been desperately attempting to deny for weeks, that I have fallen in love with you. Penelope's eyes flew open. Her breath stopped. Surely she had misheard. Surely the rain and her own misery had distorted his words into something they were not. You cannot possibly mean that, she whispered. I assure you, I mean every word with absolute precision and complete honesty, Sebastian said, his voice steady despite the tremor Penelope could see in his hands where they gripped the branch. You, with your brilliant mind and your complete inability to tolerate falsehood, have awakened something in me I believed dead and permanently buried with my wife and son 10 years ago. He shifted closer on his branch, and Penelope could see his face clearly now despite the rain and gathering darkness. His eyes held an intensity that made her chest ache. I have not felt warmth in a decade, Miss Fairfax. I have not laughed or experienced joy or looked forward to tomorrow with anything resembling hope or anticipation. I have existed rather than lived, managing my estates and business interests with mechanical efficiency whilst feeling absolutely nothing beneath the surface. And then you stood on the Merryweather Terrace and told me that stars do not require interpretation, and something long frozen in my heart began, slowly and painfully, to thaw. But I am everything unsuitable, Penelope protested, even as hope began to bloom treacherously in her chest. Complicated, disordered, peculiar, unable to navigate even basic social situations without causing disaster. You are everything essential, Sebastian corrected gently. You are order imposed upon chaos through systematic observation and rigorous methodology. You are clarity cutting through a fog of deliberate obfuscation and polite lies. You are truth in a world that drowns in falsehood. You are peculiar only in the way all genuine things are peculiar, in a world that values fakery and performance above authenticity. And I am a fool who nearly let his own cowardice and fear of vulnerability deprive him of the most extraordinary woman he has ever known. Penelope felt new tears mingling with rain on her face, but these tears carried a different quality entirely. "I have never felt warmth when seeing another person approach," she said softly. "I have never anticipated anyone's arrival with genuine eagerness. I have never felt comfortable in silence with anyone save my father. Until you. I thought something was profoundly wrong with me, that I was misinterpreting simple kindness for something deeper and more significant, setting myself up for inevitable disappointment and humiliation." "Nothing is wrong with you," Sebastian said with absolute conviction. "Nothing has ever been wrong with you. The world is wrong, with its insistence that you conform to arbitrary rules that serve no purpose except to make small minds feel superior by punishing those who cannot or will not perform the expected charade. The world is wrong to value empty flattery over honest observation, appearance over substance, conformity over authenticity." He shifted even closer now, reaching out to brush a strand of wet hair from her face with infinite gentleness. His touch was careful, reverent, and Penelope found herself leaning into it instinctively. "I should ask your permission," Sebastian murmured, his face now inches from hers. "For what?" Penelope's voice emerged as barely a whisper. "To kiss you. Here in this tree in the rain, thoroughly improper and utterly perfect." "Yes," Penelope breathed. "Please, yes." His lips met hers softly at first, questioning and careful, and then with growing certainty and intensity as she responded without hesitation or artifice. The kiss tasted of rain and hope, and something Penelope finally recognized as belonging, as having found the one place in all the world where she was exactly right as she was. When they finally drew apart, both breathing heavily, Sebastian rested his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the cool evening air. "Will you marry me, Miss Penelope Fairfax?" he asked quietly. "Will you spend your life with a reformed coward who promises to see you exactly as you are, to value you precisely for the qualities that others denigrate, to love you not despite your so-called peculiarities, but because of them, because they make you uniquely yourself and therefore uniquely precious?" "Yes," Penelope said simply, joy spreading through her chest like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Yes, I will marry you with very great pleasure and relief and hope." They climbed down from the oak together, thoroughly soaked and entirely unconcerned about appearances or propriety, or what anyone might think. Sebastian kept her hand clasped firmly in his as they walked back toward Lady Ashcroft's house, where Penelope's mother stood on the terrace, her expression transforming from concern to astonishment to barely contained delight as she took in their joined hands and sodden clothing and matching smiles. "Sebastian?" Lady Margaret said faintly, one hand rising to her throat. "Penelope, what on earth has transpired?" "I am going to marry your daughter, Margaret," Sebastian said calmly, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "With your permission and blessing, of course, though I confess I shall marry her regardless of anyone's opinion on the matter. I have wasted 10 years of my life in self-imposed emotional exile. I do not intend to waste another moment." Lady Margaret looked between them, noted their clasped hands and matching expressions of joy and determination, and did something Penelope had rarely witnessed in recent years. She laughed with pure, unrestrained delight. "Then you have my blessing and my profound gratitude, Sebastian. You have my enthusiastic permission and my heartfelt approval." She paused, then added with a mother's practical concern, "Edmund will be surprised when he learns of this development." "Edmund," Sebastian said with quiet steel beneath the polite words, "will learn to keep his uninformed opinions to himself regarding matters he does not understand. And should he prove slow to learn that lesson, I shall be delighted to educate him at length regarding the many ways in which he has underestimated and undervalued his own sister." They departed Lady Ashcroft's dinner party shortly thereafter, leaving behind a buzz of shocked speculation and gossip that would fuel conversation throughout Hampshire for weeks to come. Lady Beatrice Ashcroft was notably silent on the matter, though her daughters were heard to remark with considerable bitterness that peculiar, graceless Miss Fairfax had somehow secured the hand of the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties. The irony, Penelope thought, as she sat beside Sebastian in his carriage for the short journey back to Fairfax Manor, was that she had not secured him at all. Rather, they had found each other, 2 people who spoke the same uncommon language of precision and honesty in a world that valued neither. The courtship that followed their dramatic engagement was unlike any Penelope might have imagined had she ever allowed herself to imagine such things. Sebastian called every single day without fail, weather and business obligations permitting, and they spent hours together in her father's library or walking the extensive gardens at Fairfax Manor, discussing everything from philosophy to horticulture, from classical literature to contemporary politics. He listened with genuine interest and focused attention when she spoke passionately about her botanical work, asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated real curiosity rather than polite forbearance. He never once suggested her interests were inappropriate for a lady, or hinted that she should redirect her considerable intellect toward more traditionally feminine pursuits. More remarkably, more precious than gold, Sebastian learned to communicate with her in the direct, clear manner she required to feel secure and understood. When he was displeased about something, he said so plainly and explicitly, rather than relying on subtle hints or meaningful silences that left Penelope anxious and confused. When he desired her company, he stated the desire without elaborate circumlocution or indirect suggestion. When he had concerns or questions, he raised them openly for discussion, rather than expecting her to intuit his thoughts through mysterious processes she had never mastered. "I find this manner of communication remarkably freeing," he admitted one afternoon in late July as they reviewed preliminary wedding arrangements in the Fairfax drawing room. "All my life I have hidden behind polite evasions and careful misdirection, saying one thing whilst meaning another entirely, participating in the elaborate dance of implication that passes for civilized discourse. With you, I can simply and directly state what I mean without layers of obfuscation. It is infinitely less exhausting than constantly maintaining a performance." "Most people find my directness profoundly off-putting," Penelope observed, still not entirely convinced that this miraculous compatibility could be real and lasting. "They consider it rude or awkward, or evidence of deficient social development." "Most people," Sebastian said with quiet vehemence, "are fools who mistake elaborate performance for sophistication and confuse honesty with rudeness because truth threatens the comfortable lies upon which they have built their entire existence." Their wedding took place on a brilliant September morning at the small parish church near Windermere Park. Penelope wore a gown of ivory silk, simple in design but exquisite in execution, created by a modiste who had actually listened to Penelope's specific requirements rather than insisting she knew better. She carried a bouquet composed entirely of the rosa hybrids from her own garden, the flowers she had discovered and documented with such care, now perfectly in bloom. Sebastian stood before the altar, looking impossibly handsome in his formal attire, and made his vows with a clear, steady voice that carried to every corner of the church. When he promised to love and honor and cherish her, Penelope heard the truth of those words in every syllable. When she made her own vows in return, her voice shook only slightly with the overwhelming emotion of finding, against all odds and expectations, a place where she belonged completely. Lady Beatrice Ashcroft attended the ceremony, though she departed immediately following the service without remaining for the wedding breakfast. Her absence troubled Penelope not at all. She marked it with complete indifference and forgot about it entirely within moments. The wedding breakfast was a smaller affair than Lady Margaret had initially wished, but exactly as large as Penelope could comfortably tolerate. Sebastian, now simply Sebastian to her without the formal title creating distance between them, kept her close at his side throughout the celebration. He deflected with practiced skill any attempts by well-meaning guests to engage her in prolonged conversation that might overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. "They mean well," he murmured in her ear during a lull in the festivities, his breath warm against her skin in a manner that sent pleasant shivers down her spine. "But I see you counting the petals embroidered on the tablecloth, which indicates rising anxiety." Shall we make our escape to somewhere quieter?" "Is that permitted?" Penelope whispered back. "May we simply leave our own wedding breakfast?" "It is our wedding, my dear. We may do precisely as we please without requiring anyone's permission or approval." They slipped away to the gardens at Windermere Park, which Penelope was now learning to think of as home. Sebastian had arranged for a small greenhouse to be constructed as his wedding gift, positioned to receive optimal light throughout the day. Inside, she discovered cuttings and specimens from across England and even from the continent, each carefully selected and meticulously documented. "I thought you might enjoy having a proper dedicated space for your botanical work," Sebastian said, watching her face anxiously for signs of her reaction. "If the arrangement does not suit your requirements, we can alter it in any way you wish. I want you to be happy here, to have space to pursue your research without limitation or restriction." Penelope turned to him, tears streaming freely down her face, utterly unconcerned about the damage to her carefully applied cosmetics. "It is perfect, absolutely perfect. You are perfect. How did I become so extraordinarily fortunate?" "I am very far from perfect," Sebastian said seriously, pulling her into his arms with tender care. "My spirit is scarred in ways that may never fully heal. I am sometimes cold when I should be warm, distant when I should be present. I am learning to feel again after a decade of deliberate numbness, and the path is neither smooth nor linear. But I am yours, completely and irrevocably yours, and you are mine, and that is all that matters." Their first year of marriage brought challenges, as all marriages inevitably do, regardless of the depth of affection or compatibility of temperament. Sebastian occasionally fell into old habits of indirect communication that left Penelope confused and anxious until he learned to recognize the signs and correct course. She sometimes spoke with a bluntness that wounded him unintentionally, her honest observations cutting deeper than she realized or intended. But they learned to navigate these difficulties together, with patience and honesty, and a willingness to grow and adapt. They developed systems and signals, explicit agreements about how to communicate when emotions ran high or misunderstandings threatened. They learned each other's patterns, each other's needs, each other's boundaries. More importantly, they learned to extend grace to one another and to themselves, to recognize that growth was gradual and imperfect, that mistakes were inevitable and forgivable, that love was not a state achieved once and maintained effortlessly, but rather a choice made repeatedly, daily, hourly, moment by moment. Sebastian proved remarkably and consistently supportive of Penelope's botanical work in ways that went far beyond mere tolerance. He contacted editors and publishers in London and Edinburgh, using his title and considerable social influence to overcome their institutional reluctance to consider scientific work by a female author. He presented her research with such conviction and enthusiasm that several expressed genuine interest despite their initial prejudices. When her comprehensive treatise on British flora, particularly her groundbreaking work on natural rose hybridization, was accepted for publication by a respected Edinburgh firm in the spring of 1819, Sebastian hosted an elaborate dinner in celebration. He invited every member of the Royal Society he could locate, several professors from Cambridge and Oxford, and numerous other scholars and naturalists. The book's publication, when it finally arrived that autumn, caused a minor but definite sensation within scientific circles. Female authors of rigorous botanical texts were sufficiently rare that Penelope found herself the subject of both genuine admiration and predictable criticism. The admiration pleased her and vindicated years of careful work. The criticism she ignored with the same studied indifference she had cultivated toward Lady Ashcroft's opinions and society's judgments. The most deeply satisfying moment came at a society dinner in London, 2 years after her marriage. Lady Beatrice Ashcroft approached her during a lull in conversation, moving with the confidence of someone who expected her attentions to be welcomed. "Lady Windermere," she began with a smile that failed entirely to reach her cold eyes, "how utterly delightful to see you in town. We have not had proper opportunity to speak at length since your marriage to the Marquess. Such a surprising match, though of course we are all tremendously happy for your good fortune." Penelope studied the older woman with the same clinical detachment she might apply to an interesting but ultimately insignificant botanical specimen. She saw clearly now what she had missed before. Lady Beatrice's cruelty stemmed from her own deep insecurity, her need to elevate herself by diminishing others, her profound emptiness disguised as superiority. And Penelope found she felt not anger but pity. Pity for a woman so small and brittle that she could only feel large by making others feel tiny. "Lady Ashcroft," Penelope said clearly and calmly, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard by those nearest. "I fear I must respectfully decline the pleasure of extended conversation. I have discovered in recent years that I prefer not to socialize with individuals who habitually mistake deliberate cruelty for clever wit, who derive satisfaction from humiliating others in public forums, who measure their own worth by their success in diminishing those around them. I do hope you enjoy your evening." She turned away with perfect composure, leaving Lady Ashcroft standing open-mouthed in shocked silence, and walked directly to where Sebastian stood conversing with several members of Parliament about recent agricultural reforms. He saw her approach and immediately extended his hand, which she took with gratitude and relief. "Is everything well, my dear?" he asked quietly, his dark eyes searching her face with concern. "Everything is absolutely perfect," Penelope assured him with complete honesty. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it with deliberate tenderness, a gesture of public affection that would have horrified and overwhelmed her 2 years prior, but now filled her with quiet pride and deep contentment. The story of Lord Richard Jameson provided its own form of elegant poetic justice. The gentleman who had fled from Penelope's honest observations about his unfortunate waistcoat had made a series of spectacularly reckless speculations in the years following their brief acquaintance. By 1820, he faced imminent financial ruin, his estates heavily mortgaged, and his creditors growing increasingly insistent. Sebastian, who possessed both exceptional business acumen and detailed knowledge of commodity markets and investment opportunities, could easily have offered guidance that might have prevented or at least mitigated the disaster. He had, in fact, observed Jameson's poor decisions as they unfolded and had recognized immediately the trajectory toward bankruptcy. He chose deliberately not to intervene or offer assistance, knowing that Lord Jameson was known to scorn all advice that did not align with his own inflated opinion of himself. "Should I feel guilty?" Sebastian asked Penelope one evening as they reviewed the latest news of Jameson's financial collapse in the London papers. "I possessed knowledge that might have helped him avoid this outcome, yet I remained silent." "Did he ask for your assistance or guidance?" Penelope inquired reasonably. "No, he did not." "Then you owe him nothing whatsoever," Penelope said with firm conviction, "particularly given that he treated you quite shamefully when you were merely offering helpful fashion advice that might have improved his prospects. One might argue that his current difficulties stem from a consistent pattern of poor judgment, of which refusing your excellent artistic harmony guidance was merely one early example." Sebastian laughed, a sound that still delighted Penelope with its increasing frequency and warmth. "Your logic is impeccable as always, my dear. I shall sleep soundly tonight with a clear conscience." The greatest joy, the most profound blessing, came in the autumn of 1820 when Penelope discovered she was with child. The pregnancy proved uncomplicated from a medical perspective, though she found the physical symptoms tedious and the constant well-meaning advice from other ladies utterly unbearable. "If one more woman tells me I must avoid reading or any intellectual stimulation, lest I overtax my supposedly delicate constitution and harm the child," Penelope informed Sebastian one evening with barely suppressed frustration, "I shall begin throwing my botanical references at people with considerable force and accuracy." "I should very much like to witness that," Sebastian said with perfect solemnity, though his eyes danced with amusement. "Though perhaps you might aim specifically for those who most richly deserve such treatment. I could provide a list of suggested targets, if that would prove helpful." Their son arrived on a warm June morning, after a labor that was mercifully brief by the standards of the time, though Penelope found even those hours profoundly uncomfortable, and was quite vocal in her assessment of the entire process. Henry Thomas Thorne entered the world squalling with impressive volume, and possessing a full head of dark hair, remarkably similar in color and texture to his father's. Young Henry proved from earliest infancy to be every bit as direct and literal-minded as his mother, a tendency that became increasingly apparent as he grew and developed language. By the age of 3, he was correcting adults' factual errors with cheerful, innocent persistence, and counting objects obsessively whenever he felt overwhelmed by too much stimulation or emotional intensity. Where another father might have felt despair or concern at these familiar patterns, Sebastian delighted openly and enthusiastically in his son's quirks and characteristics. He saw in Henry not defect or disability, but simply a different way of perceiving and interacting with the world, one that required support and understanding rather than correction or suppression. "He is precisely like you," Sebastian told Penelope one sunny afternoon, watching their son methodically arrange his extensive collection of interesting stones by size, then by color, then by texture, completely absorbed in the satisfaction of creating order from chaos. "Does that concern you?" Penelope asked quietly, old insecurities rising despite years of Sebastian's consistent reassurance and demonstrated love. "It fills me with profound joy and gratitude," Sebastian replied seriously, turning to look at her with those dark eyes that had learned to show warmth again. "The world needs more people willing to speak uncomfortable truths regardless of social convention. The world needs more people who see patterns and connections where others see only chaos. The world needs more people exactly like you and our remarkable son. I consider it my sacred duty and highest privilege to ensure he grows up knowing he is valued precisely as he is, never made to feel defective or broken, never forced to pretend to be someone he is not simply to satisfy arbitrary expectations." On a late summer evening in 1823, Penelope sat in the magnificent gardens at Windermere Park, 6 months gone with their second child. The pregnancy had been confirmed only weeks before, and she was still adjusting to the idea of expanding their small family. She sat on her favorite bench surrounded by roses, counting the petals on a new hybrid variety she had been developing, a deep crimson bloom she had named Rosa Fairfaxia, which flowered twice per season and showed remarkable resistance to common diseases. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Sebastian found her there, as he so often did during these quiet evening hours, when the day's heat had faded and the garden filled with honeyed light and gentle shadow. He settled beside her on the bench without speaking, simply sharing the space and the peaceful silence. "Still counting petals?" he asked after several minutes, his voice warm with affection rather than criticism or concern. "Always," Penelope replied honestly. "It calms me, grounds me, helps me manage anxiety and overwhelming emotion. It always has from earliest childhood. I expect I shall be counting petals when I am old and grey." "Then please continue counting for the rest of our lives together," Sebastian said seriously, taking her hand and lacing their fingers together. "Count petals and stars and whatever else brings you peace and comfort. I love you exactly as you are, Penelope. I loved you when you told Lord Jameson his waistcoat made him look ill. I loved you when you climbed that oak tree in the rain, rather than face more social cruelty. I loved you when you corrected the vicar's Latin during our wedding breakfast, which I still maintain was both accurate and hilarious. And I will love you when we are indeed old and grey, still counting things whilst I sit beside you in comfortable silence, exactly as we are in this moment." "That sounds perfectly, completely wonderful," Penelope said softly, leaning against his shoulder. Their second child, a daughter they named Margaret Rose after both grandmothers, arrived that November. She proved to possess an interesting combination of her mother's brilliant analytical mind and her father's developing gift for reading people and navigating social situations with increasing skill. The combination promised either remarkable success or spectacular disaster, depending on how she chose to apply those complementary talents. Sebastian declared himself entirely unconcerned either way, confident that any child of theirs would find their proper path regardless of society's narrow expectations. Years later, when Henry brought home his first scientific paper at the age of 12, a meticulously researched and documented defense of a controversial theory that directly contradicted his tutor's teaching, Sebastian read it with tears streaming openly down his face. "What troubles you, my love?" Penelope asked, concerned by this unusual display of emotion. "Nothing troubles me in the slightest," Sebastian said, his voice thick with feeling. "I am simply overwhelmed with gratitude." Grateful that I found the courage to climb that tree in the rain all those years ago. Grateful that I refused to let my fear and my history prevent me from loving you. Grateful beyond measure for the extraordinary life we have built together, full of honest words and genuine feeling, and children who refuse to accept falsehood simply because it is deemed polite or socially appropriate to do so. I am grateful too, Penelope said, moving to embrace him. For all of it, even for Lady Ashcroft's calculated cruelty, in a strange way because it led directly to the oak tree, and the oak tree led to everything else that matters. "Two oak trees, then," Sebastian said, raising an imaginary glass in solemn toast, "and to the remarkable, extraordinary woman who climbed one and changed my entire world." As for Lady Beatrice Ashcroft, she faded gradually into relative obscurity over the following years. Her daughters made adequate but unremarkable matches with respectable gentlemen of modest means, whilst the peculiar, graceless Miss Fairfax, who had once been the primary object of her mockery, became Lady Windermere, published author of scientific texts, devoted wife and mother, and respected botanist whose work was cited in academic journals across England and the continent. The message, as Penelope herself might have stated with her characteristic directness and precision, was elegantly simple and profoundly true. Minds that perceive the world differently are not defects requiring correction, but rather differences worthy of celebration and support. Proud men who learn gentleness and emotional availability possess rare and valuable wisdom born of genuine growth. Society's cruelest members deserve neither attention nor emotional energy, as they are fundamentally small people attempting to feel large by diminishing those around them. And sometimes the very best revenge is not revenge at all, but rather the choice to live gloriously and unapologetically as one's authentic self, whilst critics wither gradually into well-deserved irrelevance, forgotten and unmissed. In the carefully tended gardens at Windermere Park, where 3 full generations of Rosa hybrids now bloomed in magnificent profusion of colour and form, creating a living testament to years of patient observation and systematic documentation, Penelope Thorne sat counting petals whilst her husband read passages aloud from her latest manuscript, and their children argued amiably but intensely about the finer points of Linnaean nomenclature versus more modern classification systems. She had found her place in the world at last, not by changing herself to fit its arbitrary and often senseless expectations, but by refusing absolutely to change at all, by insisting with quiet but immovable stubbornness upon remaining authentically and completely herself. And in that refusal, in that principled insistence upon authenticity over performance, upon truth over comfortable falsehood, upon substance over empty appearance, she had discovered something far more valuable and lasting than mere social acceptance or conventional success. She had discovered genuine love that saw and valued her completely. She had discovered honest companionship built on mutual respect and shared values. She had discovered the profound and lasting peace of being truly seen and deeply cherished exactly as she was, without requirement for pretense or performance or apology. She had discovered home. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this tale of unexpected love and hard-won acceptance. If this story of remaining courageously true to oneself and finding love that celebrates rather than merely tolerates our authentic selves has touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Your support helps us continue creating stories of love, courage, resilience, and the quiet triumph of refusing to be anyone other than exactly who we are meant to be.